Hello everyone, and as I said, we're getting into our 5-minute freedoms videos. I always try to keep these at 5 minutes and I always run a little long, so I'm going to try to move through quickly. Again, the slides will be available to any of you if you want to go through them in more detail. And I do know that these slides are wordy, but I wanted to give you, again, a bit of a study reference. I've, as always, posted the slides separately. And always, let me know if you want me to go into more detail in my videos. I can, but I've tried to keep them short because that seems to be the overwhelming preference. And with that, let's move into our first freedom. And I've picked 3 for my 5-minute freedoms videos. They're not the only rights that are protected, and we'll get into more of them in coming weeks. But here we got First Amendment, the first part of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom to petition the government for your redress of grievances. And these are freedoms that are really crucial to participation in democracy, because you have to have the ability to inform opinions and persuade others to agree with your opinions if you want to participate in a collective democratic society. You have to have the ability to question or even to challenge the government. And the nice thing about this freedom is that it provides a nonviolent outlet for conflict resolution. You don't have to riot in the streets. You don't have to take up arms against the government. You can persuade others to join you, build up strength in numbers, and, in theory, use that strength in numbers to lobby for meaningful change. Now, this is expressed in the First Amendment in terms of absolutes. So it says Congress shall pass no law. But there are limitations, and here I've got an example. Shouting fire in a crowded theater is not protected speech. It leads to, potentially personal injury, bodily harm, and it doesn't do anything to promote participation by citizens in their government. And these limitations on the freedom of speech, despite the expression of it in absolute terms, are the key to understanding what it exactly means to have the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the freedom to petition for redress of grievances in our government. Let's take some basics here. Again, I have lots of little bullet points that I'll let you read when you look at the slides. But basically, the effort to suppress anti-government speech has been around essentially as long as we've had governments. And even in our country, and even under our Constitution, we've seen this happen from the earliest days. You can think of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited the ability to criticize the government under our second president, John Adams. And this was, or has become, is always a particular problem during wartime, because, what if somebody wants to go and post, videos promoting ISIS online right now? Well, where do you fall on that? Is that freedom of speech? Is that anti-government conduct? And beyond that, I also want to note that there are restrictions on inciting illegal actions. It's one thing to argue that we should vote against this mayor and throw her out of office. It's quite another one, a completely different issue under the freedom of speech, to say, okay, grab your guns, storm the mayor's office, and start shooting. But despite this, these two sort of polar extremes, there are the gray areas in the middle. Anti-abortion protests are a great example of that. So the Supreme Court has generally looked unfavorably on any sort of government restrictions on unpopular speech, whether it be kneeling for the national anthem, which is the subject of our discussion board this unit, or other things. Maybe it's flying the Confederate flag, or wearing white robes and burning crosses. And the idea here is that the solution to offensive speech, the type of speech that makes us truly angry and offends our deepest sensibilities as individuals, the solution to that is not to prevent speech we deem offensive. It's to allow you to speak against that type of speech, counter-offensive speech, if you will. And this has become increasingly controversial, especially in the college or university setting, where we're getting attempts to promote tolerance and diversity, which most of us, I think, would agree is a good thing. But you have, whether you deem it right-wing or conservative or traditional, views, there's a backlash against that. And so you see people talking about safe spaces and things like that on college and university campuses. I'm sorry, in our government class, freedom of speech is at root a core value and something that you have to have not only in government, but in classes about government. And so, I'm not giving trigger warnings or deeming certain things out of bounds in terms of positions. I say you can't attack each other, but I certainly don't restrict your ability to attack each other's views. And so, again, here I've got some nice columns, and you can read that and see what are the options. Beyond that, we have this issue of youthful protest. And again, of course, old people, and I guess now I'm an old people, always want to rail against the youth and those upstarts and radicals. But since Vietnam, and certainly probably long before that, we have a well-established history of students at colleges and universities demonstrating against government action. And many times this takes the form of nonverbal action, which again is the subject of our discussion board this unit. And so that poses the question, well, what is speech? It also often involves conflicts between the rights of students to express themselves, but the need for some order in an educational setting. I can't have students, if I were teaching in a brick and mortar class, I can't have students standing up and telling me to go F myself. It's too disruptive. So as a general rule, the court has been pretty supportive of symbolic speech, but it's more willing to entertain restrictions on student speech in the interest of educational goals. So if you're getting disruptive actions, as I just mentioned, somebody standing up and, yelling a stream of obscenities at me in a classroom, well, no. If it's illegal activity, setting fire to the classroom, if it's vulgar activity. There was the odd case, and I don't know if any of you remember this now, with the high school student who was suspended because he attended a parade and held up a Bong Hits for Jesus sign. And that's a bit odd because the student said basically, I'm not advocating for legalization or anything, or even making a point about religion. I just thought it'd be funny. Well, okay, that's not really political speech then. But beyond that, though, many of you have lived this controversy. We also have some loose ends I want to tie up. Sexual speech. That's Janet Jackson with her wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl quite some time ago. You have demonstrations, which, think about the Occupy Wall Street movement. The court has a very vague definition of what is pornographic speech or pornographic expression. In fact, the language from the case actually is, well, we know it when we see it. But that the court has been given, or has given government more leeway to efforts to keep that off the airways, because there's a difference between being able to express it and being able to broadcast it into the living rooms of homes across America when 6-year-old children might be watching. With respect to demonstration, the court basically allows protests so long as it's not disruptive. But the government is allowed to impose so-called neutral permit requirements. Okay, if you're going to march, you have to get a permit. If you're going to have a parade, you have to get a permit. We can't deny the permit based on what you're saying, but we can require anybody who wants to march or have a parade to have a permit. You can set up protest zones. The problem with all of this, of course, becomes what happens when those those restrictions are so severe, and they might be neutral, but they effectively prohibit all protests in the relevant vicinity. And again, you can think of protests that have occurred around World Trade Organization meetings or around the Republican National Convention, where protesters aren't allowed to be within miles of the action. And again, I'm not telling you that there is or is not a right answer here. I just am asking you to think about, in your own mind, where should those lines fall? Where are the limits? And finally, I'll finish up with freedom of association. And in many ways, I mean, this idea is perfectly logical, because if you can, assemble with your friends who agree with you, that's a more meaningful way to promote government action. The right to petition for redress of grievances, which frankly is what we would today call, in many instances, lobbying. Includes the right to associate and also the right not to associate. So we have this. The Citizens United case, which is talking about the right of groups, corporations, to contribute money and so forth, becomes a little more controversial. And we will, again, get more into that later. For purposes of this video, I just want to essentially point out the potential conflicts, raise the issue, and let you all sit down on your own and as a group in the discussion boards and start to hash out where the lines could or should be drawn. And with that, I will let you go on this video. Thank you very much.